All right, so welcome to Webinar Wednesday. I'm Dr. Pebbles Turbyville, and I am the CEO of Horses and Humans Research Foundation. And tonight, I'm really excited because we have Dr. Katie Peters. And the reason I'm so excited is because she's going to talk about a big, broad part of her research on autism and riding horses. But we funded one of her studies. HHRF funded one of her studies, and it was published. So that's always exciting when we have one of our researchers come back and present some information about what they actually did with the funds we gave them. So anyway, Dr. Peters is has her occupational therapy degree, but she's also a Ph.D. in rehabilitation sciences. Did I say that right, Katie?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
All right. She teaches at CSU, which is Colorado State University, and she's really more located in the Denver area, which is called the Spur location, which is really a pretty fancy facility. If you ever get to Denver, you should stop by and see it. So with all of that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Katie.
Thank you so much, Pebbles. I am very excited to be here today, so I appreciate the invitation. I just want to say I'm going to present on several different studies that our team has done together. And if you have questions, please feel free to ask them as we go. So if you actually just put them in the chat, then Kathy's going to help us with the chat today, and she'll go ahead and interrupt me because I probably won't be able to see it. And I'm happy to answer questions as we move forward. So with that, give me a moment to share my screen. And it's showing you the wrong one, so give me a second to switch them.
That's okay. We know how technology goes. It's like everybody asks, will this be recorded? And I'm like, if technology works, it will be recorded. So everyone can see it later.
Cool. And maybe we should start at the beginning. What do you say? That seems like a good place to start.
Okay.
Okay. Pebbles, can you confirm everybody's looking at a normal looking slideshow?
Yes.
Perfect.
I can confirm your title page is up.
That's great. So as Kathy said, or sorry, as Pebbles said, I work at Colorado State University. I have the pleasure of being our research director at the Temple Grandin Equine Center. So Temple Grandin Equine Center is CSU's initiative on equine-assisted services. And we're really focused on both research and education in equine-assisted services. So my whole job is to research equine-assisted services. So I'm very grateful that foundations like Horses and Humans Research Foundation exist to help support that type of research. Today, what I'm going to do is a presentation that goes through Occupational Therapy Integrating Horses for Autistic Youth. It's a program of research that our team has been working on really since 2015-ish. But I'm going to use that program of research as a case example for how to do multi-phase intervention development and testing. So I'll go through what that means in our next couple slides. So the objective of today is really twofold. One, for you to have a better understanding of what multi-phase intervention development and testing is, why that's really important in intervention science, including developing and testing equine-assisted services interventions. And then I'll do that by using my own program of research as an example. So throughout this, you'll get to hear lots of different research findings related to occupational therapy integrating horses for autistic youth. I will give just a quick disclaimer. We work closely with an autism advisory board who helps make sure that our research is being responsive to the needs and voices of people with autism. And one of the biggest things that they have suggested that we do is use identity first terminology, meaning that I'll use the words autistic youth or autistic children throughout the presentation, fully understanding that some folks still prefer person first language like youth with autism. So I'll use autistic youth, but we respect and honor everybody's different opinions in that. All right, so I'm going to give a quick background to this program of research. Before we dove into actual intervention research, our first stop was actually to conduct a systematic review of peer-reviewed literature related to equine-assisted services for autistic youth. So this was my first foray into equine-assisted services research. This study was funded by the Carl and Caroline Swanson Foundation. And the objective of the study was to map the state of scientific and theoretical development of equine-assisted services for autistic individuals. So we wanted to know what research exists, what are the strengths, where are the gaps, and where should we go next? To do that, we conducted a systematic mapping review where we collected all of the peer-reviewed literature we could find that was related to equine-assisted services for autistic individuals. And that study was published in 2017, and these were this is a quick overview of the findings. The participants in these studies, well, first there were 33 research papers that we had identified, really ranging from 1980 to 2015. And the participants in all of those studies were all youth, autistic youth. So anywhere between the ages, I think the youngest was around 4 to 16 years old. So we didn't locate any studies on equine-assisted services for adults with autism. Within those papers, there were 9 distinct different types of equine-assisted services that were studied. As you would imagine, in this industry, there's a lot of differences in terminology about what people were calling things. So we just used the terminology that the authors used. That was further complicated by the fact that there were papers all over the world. It wasn't just US papers, there were papers from lots of different continents. And so the terminology was different in different areas of the world. I will say across these 9 distinct equine-assisted services, the most common services that were studied were therapeutic riding, often called adaptive horseback riding. And then the second most common were occupational therapy or physical therapy integrating horses. And the outcomes in these studies that were most often looked at were social interaction, communication, and behavior. Those outcomes were often found in studies of therapeutic riding or adaptive riding. And then there were also outcomes of improved motor control and related functional activities. So an example of that is improved balance, and then because of that, an improved ability to get out of the chair by themselves. Those outcomes were often found in studies of occupational therapy and physical therapy integrating horses. But across these 33 papers, what was really evident was that this body of science was in early stages of scientific development. And what I mean by that is that these papers were done by independent investigators across the globe and were mostly pilot studies where they were small n, most of the time not using a randomized design, kind of early stage pilot studies. And we know that pilot studies are really important in the development of a program of research, but the intent is that they are just that, a pilot study that then moves forward into larger randomized controlled trials to look at efficacy. But we found that in 2015, the field really hadn't done that yet. There was one randomized controlled trial that had been published. We also found that there was a pretty distinct lack of theory-driven research, meaning that at least in the published papers, it was hard to understand why it was that these professionals would choose to integrate horses into their services. What was the horse providing value? What was the horse contributing to the service? And how would that lead to the outcomes that they were measuring? So there was a need for further theoretical development of what is it that the horse, what is the mechanism of change? What is it that the horse contributes to equine-assisted services for this population that would lead to improvements in social interaction or communication or behavior? So that was a really helpful beginning study to understand kind of the strengths and the areas of opportunity in the research. Overall, these 33 papers definitely established proof of concept. By and large, there were positive outcomes after participating in equine-assisted services, but there was a need for more rigorous research using larger randomized controlled trials, and there was a need for further theoretical development. And so this is where frameworks for how psychosocial interventions for autistic youth, or really for anybody, how those frameworks can help us move research forward. So there are a variety of frameworks that demonstrate that there are different phases of research that a body of research should go through in developing and testing an intervention. The one that we chose to use for our program of research was published by Smith et al. It was developed by the National Institute of Mental Health, and it's specific to psychosocial interventions for individuals with autism. So I'll go through this framework because it's the one that we've really used for our research, but then I'll present some others afterwards as well that may be more applicable to different areas of research in equine-assisted services. So the first step in developing an intervention and then empirically testing it is to systematically apply that new intervention. One has to know what does the intervention contain, like what are the critical elements of the intervention, and what is the theory behind that intervention? How is it that the interventionists or the researchers believe that the intervention causes change in order to lead to outcomes in the participants? So once that intervention is fully developed, then it has to go through a process of manualization, meaning that the intervention is written down into a manual so that it can be replicated either across providers or across sites or across research studies, but so that it's really clear what is included in the intervention. Also, as part of the research process, it's important to develop a protocol. So not only the intervention has to be developed, but also what is your research protocol? What are the outcome measures that you're going to use? How often should the intervention be delivered? How long should the intervention last? Who is going to be providing the intervention? What type of training and background do they need to have? So the second step is developing all of those, the intervention manual, and then a protocol for assessing the intervention. And finally, after you've done those two steps, which I have learned in my career can take quite some time, then you are ready for efficacy studies. So efficacy is defined as the effect of an intervention in a very controlled environment. Oftentimes it's in a lab environment or with, in the case of equine-assisted services, with really strict criteria. For instance, strict inclusion criteria about who's going to be included in the study and who's going to be excluded. Strict criteria about how often the intervention is delivered and in what manner. Efficacy, we think of it as a very controlled study. And after most likely several efficacy studies in that highly controlled environment, if the intervention demonstrates that it is in fact efficacious, then the next step is community effectiveness studies. Effectiveness is when we lose some of that control that's inherent in research and study if the intervention is causing outcomes or leading to effects outside of that very controlled research environment. So when it's implemented in the community, how community providers are able to implement it within, the constraints that often exist within a community-based therapeutic riding center, is that intervention still effective? So this is the this is the framework that our team chose to use. I will say now this framework looks and feels pretty outdated. You'll see that it was published in 2007, which is a long time ago now. When we began our program of research in 2015, that didn't feel quite so dated, but it has served us well and it's provided a lot of good guidance. So next I'll go into some frameworks that have been developed and may be useful for researchers that are a little bit more current. One of the most widely used frameworks right now is called the NIH STAGE model. This model is really specific to behavioral intervention development. It's put forth by NIH broadly, but most often used in the National Institute of Aging. And as you can see, it's a little bit less linear than the framework that I just presented on. As our thinking and thought in intervention development has developed over the last several decades, one of the prominent findings has been that intervention development really isn't a linear process, rather it's very iterative. And so each of these stages are important, but they might not go from stage 1 to 2 to 3. Rather, you might go stage 1, okay, we're ready for stage 2. Oh no, we got to go back to stage 0 as the intervention is developed, and then you get feedback, and it's just an iterative process that could go back and forth. But within this NIH STAGE model, It starts with basic research. This is often theoretical underpinnings. So why we think horses might be beneficial for humans. That might look like, understanding how horse-human interaction impacts a person in the moment. Then based off of that basic research, it moves into intervention, generation, and refinement, which then moves to efficacy studies in that controlled research environment, moving forward to efficacy in more of a community clinic, then effectiveness, which is how it's delivered in the community at large. A new step that was not in the previous framework is implementation and dissemination. There's been a lot of work in the last couple decades to recognize that we may have a lot of very efficacious interventions, but unless we have the workforce that knows how to deliver them and the systems in place to support them and have participants who are interested and willing to participate in them, an efficacious intervention doesn't do much unless it's actually implemented and disseminated widely. So there's a whole area of research on implementing and disseminating an intervention that is considered to be efficacious. And this process is iterative and continues to go back and forth. And the last one I'll go over is a framework put out by the UK Medical Research Council on how to develop and evaluate complex interventions. So they define intervention very broadly in this framework, where it could be an intervention the way you and I think about it, as in an equine-assisted service intervention, but it could also be a public health intervention or a smoking cessation program. They define what they mean by a complex intervention quite broadly. But again, you'll see that there's a lot of the same elements that we've seen in the previous two frameworks, where the intervention is assessed for feasibility and acceptability, and that happens in an iterative process with intervention development. Then it's evaluated for efficacy, then it's implemented and evaluated for effectiveness in the community, all the while paying attention to these core elements such as context, engaging or understanding the program theory or why it is that we think the intervention works, engaging stakeholders, refining the intervention, and of course, keeping an eye to economic considerations of its actual implementation. So those are two frameworks for any researchers who are listening that I would greatly recommend as you consider developing a program of research on equine-assisted services. But so now we'll get to my program on Occupational Therapy Integrating Horses for Autistic Youth. And I'm hoping that this serves as a case example for that iterative multi-phase process of intervention development and testing. So after we conducted that systematic mapping review, it was clear that there was a need for more progressive programs of research that systematically evaluate therapy services integrating horses for autistic youth. So rather than having an investigator do one pilot study and then kind of wipe their hands of it and never move that program of research forward, we knew that we were in this for the long haul and that we wanted to, over the course of several years, rigorously develop and evaluate equine-assisted services. And my particular interest was in developing occupational therapy incorporating horses. Of course, because that's my background, I'm an occupational therapist and I worked primarily with autistic youth. And what I noticed was that in that review, most of the outcomes of therapy services integrating horses were motor outcomes and then related adaptive behaviors. But that was a little bit in conflict with my experience of working with autistic youth in that their goals and their parents' goals were much more often about social behavioral outcomes. Autism is defined by impairments in social interaction and social communication, and difficulties in self-regulation are really inherent to autism. And so, yes, sometimes we were working on motor skills, but it was far more prevalent for us to be working on self-regulation and social skills. And I saw that with horses as well, that a lot of kids with autism would come and either within an occupational therapy session or in their therapeutic riding session, they would seem much more social and much more regulated during that interaction with the horse. And so I was really interested in researching that and maybe quantifying that a little bit. So with all of that background, the purpose of this program of research from the outset has been to rigorously develop and evaluate occupational therapy integrating horses in order to address social and behavioral goals for autistic youth. So back to our phases of research. The first phase is systematic application of a new intervention. Smith et al. Define that the goals of this phase are to refine the techniques of the intervention and document the clinical significance of the intervention's effects. Meaning, even with just a few small N research participants, do we see that they're making meaningful changes or meaningful improvements after participating in that newly developed or that systematic application of a new intervention? So that's exactly where we began. Smith recommends single case experimental designs. So phase 1 of this research was systematic application of occupational therapy integrating horses for autistic youth. It was also funded by the Carl and Caroline Swanson Foundation. And the objective of this study was to operationalize a screening, evaluation, and assessment protocol, as well as an intervention protocol for occupational therapy integrating horses for autistic youth. We did that through a single case experimental design where 8 participants participated in 10 weeks of occupational therapy integrating horses. And then this very early stage, we had very few, I guess, requirements or asks of the therapists. Rather, we recruited therapists to provide therapy in this study and asked them, they were therapists who had been doing this for decades, asked them what they think it is that is beneficial for autistic youth to be working with horses and how they typically work with this population and what therapy typically would look like if we were going to address social and behavioral goals. Overall, what we found using that single case experimental design was that participants improved in their individual occupational performance goals that were related to social functioning and self-regulation. They also demonstrated improved social motivation and decreased irritability. So that's an indicator of improved self-regulation. So those 6 participants did demonstrate clinically significant improvements after 10 weeks of occupational therapy integrating horses. We also, through lots of interviews with the providers, identified what those occupational therapists believed were the critical elements of integrating horses into occupational therapy for this population, as well as what they believed were the hypothesized mechanisms of change. So in conjunction with interviewing the providers and doing a pretty comprehensive literature review, we identified several theorized or hypothesized mechanisms of change, which is just an intervention science way of saying why we think that horses are beneficial for youth with autism. We also interviewed parents who participated in this study, and they, by and large, found the intervention acceptable and were excited for their child to be participating. And they also gave us an idea of what we should be measuring. They would say things like, my child is just so much more calm the day that they go riding. And we're like, oh, that's good to know. Maybe we could measure that. So a lot of interviews with stakeholders helped us really thoroughly understand and define what needed to be involved in the intervention and how to measure its outcomes. So after all of that, we walked away with 3 key hypothesized mechanisms of change, or what it is about integrating horses into occupational therapy that we believe is beneficial for autistic youth. The first is related to social engagement. Autism is defined by difficulty with social interaction and social communication, in addition to restricted and repetitive behaviors. So we know that decreased social engagement is an inherent part of autism. And that can make it really difficult to engage a child in an intervention if they are just naturally difficult to get to engage socially. But if a child isn't socially engaged in what you're doing, if they're not paying attention to the therapy session, then they're probably not learning what it is that you're trying to teach them during the therapy session. But we have some research that demonstrates that animals can act as social catalysts for autistic youth, meaning that when youth with autism are in the presence of animals, they're actually more socially engaged with the other people in that environment. And so we can use that motivating and socially engaging power of the horse to get the child to attend and engage in the therapy process, which we believe can improve therapy outcomes. Another key hypothesized mechanism of change has to do with physiological regulation. So we know that youth with autism struggle with self-regulation. Self-regulation is defined as the ability to monitor and then change your states of physiological arousal. So how, if you're over aroused, that might look like irritability or hyperactivity. If you're under aroused, that might look like being sleepy or lethargic. And we all have this kind of middle state of being calm but alert and engaged. That's ideal for us to be learning. But we know that youth with autism struggle with that. And so we believe that the movement of the horse can be really beneficial to help the child maintain that kind of calm but alert state of physiological arousal. Part of that is very much the movement of the horse. From an occupational therapy perspective, we think about it in terms of vestibular input and proprioceptive input, as well as to some extent tactile input and all the other senses. And we believe that those inputs in autistic youth can help them maintain that calm, alert state of physiological arousal. But part of it is also just, again, how exciting and motivating and engaging horses are. Kids are more likely to be engaged in that, and that helps maintain that optimal physiological arousal. And the third hypothesized mechanism of change that came out of this study was the idea about lots and lots of opportunities for concrete positive reinforcement. So positive reinforcement is something that happens after a desired behavior that makes that desired behavior more likely to happen again in the future. So with my 4-year-old, if he says please, then he gets his ice cream treat, and then he's more likely to say please in the future. But that's a very, I guess, simple example. We know that positive reinforcement is an evidence-based strategy when working with autistic youth. So autistic youth, and really honestly most children, learn very well through positive reinforcement. And the equine environment offers lots of natural opportunities for positive reinforcement. The most common example is that if a child says walk on, then the horse immediately walks on, and that serves as a concrete positive reinforcement for their social communication of saying walk on. But the therapist can design a whole bunch of different activities so that the child's goal behavior or the child's social communication, or sometimes the child's improved self-regulation is positively reinforced, which then makes that behavior more likely to happen again in the future. So that was a very helpful phase 1 study, and we decided that we were ready to move on to phase 2, which is manual and protocol development. Smith et al. Say that the goals of this phase are to assemble an intervention manual, create fidelity measures. In intervention science, fidelity is whether or not the intervention was delivered the way that was intended. So we actually create a checklist of what we want to be included in each intervention session, and then observe sessions to ensure that, in fact, the intervention did include those things. So this phase includes actually creating that measure. The phase also includes testing the feasibility of the intervention across different sites. So feasibility is we're looking at lots of different markers that it's actually feasible to implement the intervention the way it's intended to. Can you recruit the participants that you think are appropriate for this intervention? Once those participants are recruited, do they actually attend most of the sessions? Is your fidelity high, meaning the intervention was delivered the way it was intended? Are the outcome measures completed at a reasonable rate so that you can feel confident that, that if you were to move forward, then those outcome measures would be completed in a larger randomized controlled trial? Lots of different elements of feasibility that, if you get wrong, have the opportunity to really squash large-scale efficacy research later down the road. Another goal is to assess the acceptability of the intervention. So we know that intervention acceptability is very predictive of intervention efficacy, meaning that if participants are satisfied with the intervention and are willing to attend and find value in the intervention, then it's more likely to be efficacious. And same thing from the provider perspective. Do providers find it acceptable? Are they satisfied with the intervention? Because if not, then they're unlikely to deliver it the way that it's intended. So intervention acceptability is an important thing to consider during intervention development. And finally, in this framework, the goals are to get preliminary participant information to help with a future power analysis. So a power analysis is required in phase 3 efficacy research to say that it's how you calculate the number of participants that you need in a randomized controlled trial. But you get estimates about how large of an effect the intervention has from smaller studies to include in a future power analysis. I will give a quick caveat that the thinking on this is changing, that now power analyses are often determined by the minimal clinically significant difference. And scholars are more and more skeptical that small-scale research effect sizes actually translate into large-scale research effect sizes. But this is how we did our study back several years ago now. It's just a caveat about moving forward that the thinking on that is continuing to evolve. But so the research designs for this phase 2 include multi-site pilot studies. This allows for testing the feasibility of the intervention at several different sites, and focus groups with clinicians and families at each site in order to assess the acceptability of the intervention. So first, we had to develop the intervention manual. In doing so, we combined those theorized mechanisms of action that I already went over about what we think it is beneficial about integrating horses into occupational therapy. We combined that with best practices in occupational therapy, and then also combined that with evidence-based intervention strategies for working with autistic youth. So those theorized mechanisms of action was that the horse improves social engagement, helps with physiological regulation, and provides lots of opportunities for concrete positive reinforcement. We included best practices in occupational therapy of top-down evaluation, meaning that the intervention begins with an evaluation of the participant that is occupation-focused and considers what goals they have outside of the equine environment. What functional gains do they want to make in their home, school, community lives? And we intentionally partnered with families because we know that family-centered care is best practice as well. And we integrated lots of evidence-based strategies that are specific to autistic youth, such as incorporating youth strengths and motivators into the intervention, using a multisensory intervention, which is pretty inherent in working with horses, using lots of positive reinforcement, and then scaffolding the child's goal behavior using prompting, shaping, chaining, and feedback, which I realize is a lot of jargon that's specific to occupational therapy, but I don't think it's necessary to understand the overall program of research. So then we submitted this grant to the Horses and Humans Research Foundation, and we were so grateful that they funded this study. This was our first kind of larger scale study of this intervention, and it would not have been possible without Horses and Humans Research Foundation. So thank you very much. The aims of this study were to assess the feasibility of implementing occupational therapy integrating horses and the assessment protocol at 2 different facilities. We also assessed the acceptability of the intervention manual and the assessment protocol to both the providing occupational therapists as well as to the parents of the autistic youth who participated. The reason we assessed acceptability of the parents is because many of the youth were minimally verbal, and so it just got a little tricky about how we would assess acceptability for that population. But I will say we're doing that in the fall, and I'm very excited about that. But for this study, we accepted intervention acceptability of the parents. And then we estimated the size of the effect of the manualized intervention in comparison to a no-horse control group. We were looking at outcomes including irritability and hyperactivity, social functioning, and individual occupational therapy goals. And I will say that no-horse control group was a waitlist control group where everybody eventually got to receive occupational therapy integrating horses, but half of the participants were randomly assigned to receive occupational therapy in a garden environment first, before then moving forward with occupational therapy integrating horses. Oh, we had a whole slide on that. So it was a multi-site randomized controlled trial of OT integrating horses versus a waitlist control of occupational therapy in a garden. There were 24 autistic youth in this study, ages 6 to 13 years old, who had a clinical levels of irritability and hyperactivity. And they had to have an IQ of 55 or above, mostly to ensure that they were able to follow one-step directions and participate in the intervention. The first thing that we did was an occupational therapy evaluation. There were 3 potential goal areas, and the occupational therapists work with the child and their parent or caregiver to develop goals related to self-regulation, social communication, or play. So this was very parent and child driven. They got to choose which goals were most important to them. An example of a self-regulation goal might be waiting for a desired item or calming down after they were upset. A social communication goal might have been initiating greetings or maintaining a back and forth conversation. An example of a play goal might be taking turns or inviting a peer to play. So they received 10 weeks of occupational therapy integrating horses, and we measured preliminary efficacy with the following assessment tools. First was goal attainment scaling, where therapists scaled the individual occupational performance goals that they set at the initial evaluation on a 5-point scale, where everybody starts at -2, and then based off of how they progress on that goal, if they had a level of 0, that means that they met their goal, or if they had a level of +2, it means that they far exceeded their goal. We also used a parent report tool called the Social Responsiveness Scale, 2nd edition, that measures autism-specific social functioning. This is highly reliable and valid and one of the most commonly used outcome measures in autism intervention research. And then finally, we used the Aberrant Behavior Checklist community to measure self-regulation. Particularly, we looked at the irritability and hyperactivity scales. This is also highly reliable and valid. It got its start as one of the most prominent outcome measures used in the REP trials, which are drug intervention development for autism, and it's used as a primary endpoint for self-regulation for both drug trials and for behavioral interventions. So it was important to us that we were using these well-established outcome measures that are used often in autism research so that we could demonstrate that that Equine-assisted Services or Occupational Therapy Integrating Horses is making these gains that are already respected by the scientific community and by the clinical community. And then finally, we also used the PDCAT ASD. That stands for the Pediatric Evaluation of Disability Inventory. And the CAT means that it's a computer adaptive test. So parents, it's a like online checklist that parents complete online. And that measures functional abilities in 3 domains. I believe there's a motor domain, a social cognitive domain, and a responsibility domain. I think I'm missing one domain, but it's their ability to do everyday life activities. And these are some of the results from that first study. On the left is what happened, or were their goals prior to beginning occupational therapy in an equine environment. And on the right is their goal ratings after 10 weeks of occupational therapy in an equine environment. Everybody had a primary goal and then a secondary and tertiary goal. So the orange line is their primary goal and the green line is an average of all 3 goals. But what we see is that if level 0 is attaining their individual occupational therapy goal, on average, everybody exceeded their individual occupational therapy goal. So they made progress on their occupational therapy goals, which was important because that measures function outside of the barn. We were making differences in their ability to do everyday life things in their home and community environments. This is the results of the Aberrant Behavior Checklist. The orange lines are before occupational therapy and the green lines are after occupational therapy. And you can see here that participants had statistically significantly reduced irritability after occupational therapy integrating horses. And they did also have a reduction in hyperactivity that was not quite statistically significant. That p-value was less than 0.15. Which we were still pretty happy with given the relatively low N of the study, but definitely needs to be investigated in future research. Then our measure of social functioning included 5 subscales, and we found statistically significant improvements in social motivation and trends towards improvements in social communication after occupational therapy integrating horses. We also saw trends towards improvements in restricted and repetitive behaviors. And finally, this is our functional measure. Daily activities was a subskill that I had forgotten. But we saw improvements that were not statistically significant in mobility and in social cognitive functional behaviors. So those were all pre-post improvements. So we took everybody that received occupational therapy integrating horses and from the beginning to the end of occupational therapy. But then we also did some analyses to look at the comparison to the waitlist control group. So those 12 participants who first received occupational therapy in a garden and the progress that they made during that control condition. And what we found was that 75% of participants improved in their individual occupational performance goals after occupational therapy integrating horses, whereas only 33% met or exceeded their goal after the occupational therapy in a garden waitlist condition. So participants were more likely to meet or exceed their goal after OT integrating horses. The other statistically significant finding was in the social cognitive functional abilities. These abilities improved in participants who received occupational therapy integrating horses, and actually got a little bit worse in participants who were receiving occupational therapy in a garden. So that was a statistically significant difference, demonstrating that OT was integrating horses was more likely to cause gains in social cognitive functional abilities. So overall, what this study found was, one, the intervention was feasible to implement, which was really important. We were able to recruit the amount of participants that we wanted to. They all had high attendance rates. We had high rates of intervention fidelity. Participants completed their outcome measures. And the intervention was also acceptable to both parents of youth who participated and occupational therapists who delivered it. And we found statistically significant improvements in irritability, social motivation, and progress on individual therapy goals. We found non-significant trends towards improved hyperactivity and social communication as well. But perhaps most importantly, after all of that, was that we learned what we needed to refine in our intervention protocols to better prepare us for large-scale efficacy research. First, we learned that we definitely needed more standardization in the intervention manual. Because we were so participant focused and client-centered, the interventions ended up looking widely different from one another, depending on if we were working on self-regulation goals or play goals or social communication goals. And while that is definitely reflective of occupational therapy practice, it would make it difficult to run large-scale efficacy research because we wouldn't know what intervention we were studying if it was looking so different across participants. And so we knew that we needed to make that a little bit more standard, so the intervention was more standard across participants, while still allowing for the intervention to be client-centered and individualized, just in a more standard way. We also found that we needed a more feasible control group. What we found was that we had a lot of participants who we had to exclude from occupational therapy in the garden environment due to safety considerations. In autism, it's fairly common. There's a phenomenon where, sorry, I'm forgetting the word for it, where youth with autism often will run away, elopement. And so we had a hard time including participants who had a history of elopement because we didn't feel like we could keep them safe in that large outdoor garden environment. And that would create a problem in future large-scale trials because we want to be able to have the same inclusion and exclusion criteria for occupational therapy integrating horses as we do for our control condition. So we knew that we had to get away from the garden control condition and create something else.
Hang on, Katie. I think we have a question.
Sure.
Okay.
The question was, why would the control group go down in the social emotional skills? And why would it not stay the same? Any thoughts on that, or could you?
Yes, so these are parent report measures, and a little bit of variability is expected because parents are going to fill it out differently from time to time, or Maybe something happened at school that affected their social abilities. We expect in human subjects research to have variability in our outcome measures. We wouldn't expect it to be exactly the same over time, because humans change over time. Regardless of how much we wish it were simpler, our behavior is not all that consistent. And so this definitely needs to be looked at in a larger randomized controlled trial to see if this was just chance of variability both ways, or if there really was a true improvement going on in the intervention group, in the experimental group, that did not happen in the control group. But I would say that's just natural human variability is how we would describe that finding.
That certainly makes sense.
I was about to say, this opened up some other questions, so hang on.
Sure.
Yeah, so what assessment did you use for establishing IQ?
Yes, we used the Leiter International Performance Scales. It's an assessment of nonverbal intelligence, which is considered best practice in autism because verbal skills are so impacted by autism itself. So most of the time we use IQ assessments that look at only nonverbal intelligence. So that was administered at the screening visit to ensure they were eligible for the study.
And this one may be that we're jumping ahead, but is there follow-up to see if any of the positive outcomes continue after the 10-week? Is that jumping ahead in your,
Not in this study, there was not. We didn't do a post-test follow-up, but I will say we're in the midst of a study. We're doing a 6-month follow-up. I don't have the results from that yet, so I can't really tell you. But thus far in our program of research, we don't have any data back yet from a post-test follow-up. But that's a great segue into the next study that came after this one. Are there any other questions I need to address first?
No, you got them
Okay.
all.
So we decided we needed to stay in this phase 2 intervention development and refinement because there were some things that we needed to fix with the intervention before we were ready for large-scale efficacy testing. So we submitted a grant to the Human Animal Bond in Colorado. And the aims of this grant were to create a safe, feasible, and manualized control group for the OT horseplay intervention, Occupational Therapy Integrating Horses. Then to enhance that intervention manual by increasing the standardization within the manual while still allowing for individualization. And then again, to assess the feasibility of this modified intervention, including implementation, acceptability, and preliminary participant outcomes. So what we did to the intervention manual was we recognized that we needed to narrow in on what the intervention was addressing. And so we created intervention focused specifically on self-regulation. So we kept all of our occupational therapy critical elements, refined them slightly. We are still purposely integrating horses based on our theorized mechanisms of action. But what we added was a focus on self-regulation using zones of regulation. So zones of regulation is probably the most widely used self-regulation curriculum. It was created by an occupational therapist. And the basis of it is that it categorizes emotions into these 4 different zones and then helps participants, one, learn about the emotions, how they feel in their own body and how they look in other people. And then finally, learn tools to help control those emotions. So if they want to move from the blue zone to the green zone or from the yellow zone to the green zone, then they have tools to be able to manage and regulate their emotions. I realize I don't have a citation on that slide, but that was created by Leah Coopers. So we did some intervention adaptation or some adaptation of that zones of regulation curriculum to purposely integrate horses into the curriculum if it was appropriate for the participant. So I will say not all of our participants learn this equine zones of regulation. If that's too abstract or not concrete enough for them, then at times it's appropriate not to introduce them to this visual. But oftentimes it can be really difficult to talk about emotions in ourselves and maybe a little bit easier to talk about emotions in a horse. So we teach them this program both through learning about themselves and learning about their horse. So after we modified the main intervention manual, it then made it a bit easier to come up with a control condition where the control condition is occupational therapy in a clinic that still includes all of our same occupational therapy critical elements, still includes the zones of regulation curriculum, and we're just removing horses from the intervention. So we created that intervention manual, occupational therapy using zones of regulation concepts in a clinic. Then we conducted a single arm A/B pilot study. I will say this was not our original intent. This study happened in 2020. So nothing went as expected that year. Originally, we were going to do a crossover design where where participants were randomized to receive either the clinic first or the equine first and then switch. But our facilities shut down for COVID, and it just so happened that the clinic facility opened up before the equine facility did. So we ended up giving everybody 10 weeks of occupational therapy in a clinic first. And then after the equine facility opened up, we did 10 weeks of occupational therapy in an equine environment. That still allowed us to really look at intervention feasibility and acceptability, which were the primary aims. But it does have some limitations for inferences we can make about efficacy.
Yeah, go.
So what we found was the middle column is the feasibility and acceptability results for the clinic condition, and the far right column is the feasibility and acceptability results for the equine condition. And what we found was 100% retention across both conditions, high attendance across both conditions, and high intervention. We also found that parents completed 100% or almost 100% of all of the assessments except for the PDCAT. That was that computer adaptive test, and we found it was difficult for participants to complete a whole battery of assessments in our online platform where the assessments were, and then have to go to a different online platform to complete the PDCAT. So we had a lower response rate for that PDCAT assessment. But we had high rates of both parent acceptability, 100% were satisfied or very satisfied with both conditions, and occupational therapist acceptability, 100% were satisfied or very satisfied with both conditions. So this is a preliminary look at participant outcomes. Time 1 is before either intervention. Time 2 is after occupational therapy in the clinic. And time 3 is after occupational therapy in the equine environment. And what we found was that there were significant improvements in all of our self-regulation indicators from time 1 to time 2. So they significantly improved after occupational therapy in the clinic. But then that really plateaued. They maintained those improvements, but they didn't make further improvements. Part of that is that after 10 weeks of occupational therapy in the clinic, most of our participants would not have qualified for the study anymore. They didn't have high enough levels of irritability to meet our inclusion criteria. So we think this is likely a floor effect. They had improved a lot, and there wasn't very much room for them to improve much more. But then if we look at the social functioning outcomes, it was really interesting. We did not see any statistically significant differences between time 1 and time 2. So there were no improvements after occupational therapy in the clinic, but we did see statistically significant improvements after occupational therapy in the equine environment. So we see that the total social functioning score drops at time 3, and that was really driven by the social communication subscale. So this makes us wonder, is there additive benefit of integrating horses into occupational therapy in social communication gains? Overall, we decided that these newly refined interventions were feasible to implement, acceptable to parents and occupational therapists. It made us wonder if potentially horses offer additive benefits in social communication. But we also, as we were moving this program of research forward, realized that there is a need for outcome measures that don't rely on parent report. Obviously, we can't mask or blind a parent to if their child is receiving therapy in a clinic or with horses. That will be very evident to the parent. And although self-regulation and social skills are most often measured through parent report, that was a limitation of all of our studies, was that that parent report could likely be biased. So we knew that in moving forward, we wanted to identify some other outcome measures that didn't rely on that parent report. So after years and years of being in phases 1 and 2 of intervention development, we finally felt like we were ready for large-scale efficacy research. So we submitted a grant to the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development through their R21 mechanism. And this study has an N of 64 participants. And this study is actually ongoing right now. So we received that grant and we are in the midst right now of conducting that study. So just to pause, this is the first time I've been federally funded for research, and I'm very excited by it, and also very humbled and aware of the fact that we would not have gotten this funding without funding mechanisms like Horses and Humans Research Foundation, because those preliminary pilot studies are so important to get us to the point where we were ready for a randomized controlled trial, not only so that we could run a high quality randomized controlled trial, but also so that we could convince a federal funder like the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development that we were a safe bet, that they could fund this study because we had so much preliminary data leading up to this grant application. So the aims of this study are to examine the preliminary efficacy of occupational therapy using zones of regulation concepts in an equine environment to that same occupational therapy intervention in a clinic environment, looking at self-regulation and social functioning outcomes. Really the same battery of parent report assessments. So we looked at hyperactivity, irritability, emotional reactivity, and dysphoria, and then that same social functioning measure, the social responsiveness scale. And we are keeping our attainment of individual therapy goals as one of our outcome measures as well. But then our second aim for this grant was to identify potential physiological mechanisms that explain how integration of horses into occupational therapy can impact self-regulation in autistic youth. So really, this aim is focused on quantifying that hypothesized, theorized mechanism of change that horses help to help with the physiological regulation in autistic youth. We often see and hear from parents that youth are calmer when they're with the horse. So we're looking to see if we can actually quantify that physiologically. And our first go of that is through looking at salivary cortisol, which is an indicator of stress released by the HPA axis, as well as salivary alpha amylase, which is an indicator of the autonomic nervous system. We're hypothesizing that stress will decrease, so decreased salivary cortisol, but we're actually hypothesizing that salivary alpha amylase will increase because alpha amylase looks more at arousal, but isn't necessarily associated with negative stress. So we think that that would indicate that youth are excited and engaged and motivated, but they're not stressed.
Katie, there was one question about how many times per week the children were seen in the study.
That's a great question. Yeah, it's hard for me to tell how much methods details I should put in these, so I'm glad you asked. Participants come to 10 consecutive therapy sessions once a week, and therapy sessions last 60 minutes, but that includes parent education. So they're probably mounted on the horse. We aim for about 45 minutes of mounted time. So the therapist checks in with the parent at the beginning of the study, sees how the week went, see if there's anything they need to address specifically in therapy. They get their helmet and safety belt on. They mount the horse and do a 45-minute therapy session. And then they dismount and the child goes to give some saliva samples, and the therapist touches base with the parent again to give some education on what they worked on that day and how they can help integrate those skills at home. Yes. So overall, I just want to thank you all for being here today, but definitely thank the whole team of people that it takes to make research like this happen, particularly my mentor, Dr. Wendy Wood, who was the previous director of Temple Grandin Equine Center, and she was the PI on a lot of these studies while I was a graduate student. And our team at Temple Grandin Equine Center now, who is implementing our current randomized controlled trial, including Ellen Rankins, who's on the call today. She's our study coordinator, so she could actually answer just as many questions as I could about this research study. But research takes a team, and I'm really grateful for all of the teamwork that I've had to get us to this spot. So at this point, I'd love to open it up for questions.
So the other question was about, were the sessions group or individual?
That is one of the things that changed as we refined the intervention protocol. So originally in the Horses and Humans Research Foundation study, and in the HABIC study, the Human Animal Bond in Colorado. So the 2 pilot studies that I presented results on, participants were paired, meaning that after we recruited the 10 participants that were going to be receiving therapy in that session, we tried to pair them based off of similar self-regulation abilities and similar social communication abilities. And then those pairs received therapy at the same time in the same place, but they each had their individual occupational therapist and their individual therapy goals. The reason for that being, particularly before we narrowed in on just self-regulation, a lot of our goals were social communication and play goals. And so we really wanted there to be a same age peer in the arena with them that they could be practicing those new emerging skills with. I will say from a feasibility standpoint, that was doable in, a 20 participant study, a 14 participant study. It would be so hard to do on a large scale with a large randomized controlled trial. And there were even problems in our smaller studies. For instance, some of our pairings were really good, where we had a good match of social communication abilities. And then sometimes, we had a 13-year-old boy with an 8-year-old girl, and we knew that wasn't a great match to be talking about emotions, but that's kind of the best that we could do. And so those pairings were at times problematic. So for the current randomized controlled trial, we have moved away from that, where we're intentionally not including peer interaction in either the equine environment or the clinic environment, so that it's much more of an individual therapy session. Sometimes there's still 2 therapy sessions going on at the same time because we have such a large arena, but we're not encouraging that social interaction to be part of the intervention itself.
I have a question. What about the volunteers? Do you try to be consistent with the volunteers, and also if you change them, do you see different interaction, especially since you're working with the social aspect?
Yes, for both volunteers and horses, we make those pairings at the beginning, and we try really hard for that to be a consistent pairing throughout the 10 weeks. I can't say that always happens. People get sick or are on vacation, but we do at the beginning of each cohort ask volunteers to sign up for the full 10-week session, and let them know it's important to them that their kid looks forward to seeing them each week, and try to encourage that attendance. And horses the same. Again, of course, a horse, may be out for a week if they're not feeling well or something. And occasionally we do need to make horse changes if our initial pairings just end up not being a good pairing. But for the most part, we try to keep that consistent throughout the 10 weeks. When that does change, I'll say it's really participant dependent on how big of an impact that has on the child, as I'm sure you all who have done this for some time understand. So we have had some participants where they had a new horse for the week and they didn't even realize it. And then we had some participants where we had to switch horses for a week, and it caused a full 20-minute meltdown before we were able to move forward and do therapy. So I think it's participant dependent, but it's something that we believe is important and could definitely potentially be part of kind of the magic, be one of the mechanisms of change. So we try to keep it consistent if we can.
And do you have, go ahead, Kathy.
A question came up of whether the sessions were all in the indoor or do you incorporate going outside?
In our 2 pilot studies, we were able to go outside because of the facilities we were at. This current randomized controlled trial is happening at our very new, very pretty Denver Spur location, but we are located in the middle of downtown Denver. So we have a small outdoor arena. I don't envision we'll use it for the study. We have not thus far. So most of the sessions are in the indoor arena. I will say, from a variables perspective, I kind of like that because it kind of isolates the horse as the mechanism of change. Because we do know that exposure to nature is really great for kids. So if we get outcomes, we're more likely to attribute that to interaction with the horse rather than being outside in a natural environment.
What is I've worked with children, and the helmet is one issue, but I can't imagine trying to get saliva.
Yes, it's one of our inclusion criteria. That at an initial screening visit, they have to be able to put a saliva swab in their mouth. But it is a very kid-friendly way of getting saliva. It's a little foam rod They can either put the whole thing in their mouth if they want. Some of them chew on it like gum, or just kind of stick it under their tongue while the other half sticks out. And we've only excluded a very small handful of participants because they're unwilling to do the saliva sample. Most of the time, we call it a lollipop or something, and they're kind of okay with it. Or if they have a week that they're particularly dysregulated and they say, no, I'm not doing the saliva sample this week, that's fine. And we just skip that piece for the week. But overall, we've collected, I'd say, over 90% of the samples that we were hoping to collect. So it's been better than expected.
That's great.
Yeah.
We were there when a mother and child were there, and they were trying to get into the study. So, of course, I don't know if they did or not, but she was super excited. But have you got a student in at one point in time, and then they decided they did not like horses, or did they all decide, yay, this is great, I love horses?
Yeah, that's something that we are paying attention to for sure. So I will say part of the screening visit is that they have to mount a horse and ride following our safety rules for 15 minutes. So again, that's one of those where we've probably excluded 5-ish. Ellen runs the screening visit, so she might have a better sense of how many we've excluded, but I would say not very many participants have been excluded for that reason. And horses are all over our flyers, so parents really know what they're walking into and have kind of prepped their kid for that most of the time beforehand. But the level of excitement due to the horse is really variable across participants. There are some participants where you wouldn't even think that they know that they're on a horse. That it's kind of, that's not really the most exciting thing to them. They'd rather be playing basketball. And then there are some participants where they just want to love on their horse and they take pictures with their horse, and it's really sad on the last day when they have to say goodbye to their horse. And so that is definitely one thing I'm interested in about how much does that affect our outcomes? How much does that human-animal bond affect our outcomes? We don't currently have a great standardized measure of human-animal bond, but we are doing just a therapist report scale of how much they believed the child was interested and motivated by the horse, as well as a therapist report scale of how much they thought the movement of the horse was beneficial. Because there are some participants where they're kind of hyperactive and really sensory seeking, and then you just see them like physically relax when they're on the horse. And so we're rating to what extent that was important for that participant or not. And I'll be interested when we get all of the data back if those can help explain kind of our responders versus our non-responders.
All right, well, I think that pretty much concludes our session today. I think there's no more questions in the chat room. And I just wanted to say thank you again, Katie, for doing an awesome job of presenting this information. I was trying to take notes, but I'm glad it's recorded so I can go back and watch it again. So again,
absolutely. Thank you for the invitation and for funding our study.
Yes, thank you.